Namaskar and welcome viewers. You are with me Surbhi Unyal and I teach philosophy at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. Viewers, we have been doing a series on Introduction to Philosophy, and in that we have been doing Indian philosophy. In our last lecture we discussed Nyāya epistemology, and in that we discussed Nyāya perception. In today's lecture, moving forward with the discussion on Nyāya epistemology, we would be doing inference or Anuman. So according to Nyāya philosophy, the second source of valid knowledge is inference. It is known as Anuman. The term Anuman is formed by combining two words, Anu and Man. Anu signifies after and Man denotes cognition. Therefore, from an etymological perspective, Anuman or inference can be understood as after cognition. In more literal terms, Anuman refers to knowledge that arises subsequent to acquiring other knowledge. It is defined as that cognition which presupposes some other cognition, and that is why it has been given this name Anuman, that means after cognition. So it presupposes some other cognition for a specific cognition. So it is described as a form of cognition that relies on prior cognition. So there has to be a prior cognition on which we are going to infer something. So it is an indirect or mediated process, emerging through the presence of a mark or a middle term, which is referred to as ling or hetu, which is consistently linked with the major term, which is known as sadhya. So this whole process of inference, which is considered to be as indirect or mediated, it emerges when there is a middle term or there is a hetu which is linked with the major term, that is sadhya. Now, the prior knowledge entails recognizing the mark or that link as having a universal association with the sadhya or the major term, and its presence in the paksh, which is the minor term. So this is how the major, minor and the middle term are related in this whole process. So the prior knowledge, this entails that there is a mark or a link which has a universal association with the sadhya or the major term, and it's present in the minor term. Therefore, in the Nyāya system, inference or Anuman is defined as comprehending an object not through direct observation, but by utilizing knowledge of the link or the sign and its universal connection, which is known as vyapti with the inferred object. So direct observation we have already done in the previous lecture, which would be pratyaksh or the perception. But here it's not the direct observation. And that's how inference is different from perception, because in perception there is a direct observation, while in inference there is no direct observation. It is an indirect or immediate process, where we try to look for the mark or the link which has a universal connection with the sadhya. So this invariable concomitance, which is vyapti, is the nerve of the inference. So vyapti is the invariable association of the middle term, hetu, with the major term, that is sadhya. So this connection between the hetu and the sadhya is known as vyapti, which is also known as invariable concomitance. Now the presence of the middle term in the minor term is called Pakshadharmita. So the knowledge of Pakshadharmita as qualified by Vyapti is called Paramarsh. And inference is defined as a knowledge arising through Paramarsh. That is, the knowledge of the presence of the major in the minor through the middle, which resides in the minor and is invariably associated with the major. So this together is considered to be as the Vyapti or the invariable concomitance. So in Nyāya philosophy, inference, known as Anuman, is a process of reasoning or knowledge acquisition that involves drawing conclusions about unperceived facts or events based on observed evidence and established rules of inference. And in fact, Nyāya is considered to be one of the major schools in contributing to this whole process of inference in the Indian context, because this Nyāya school has given so much emphasis on and gives an elaborate discussion on the process of inference, where we use the process of reasoning or knowledge acquisition, which is done by drawing conclusions. And how do we draw conclusions? These conclusions are drawn about the unperceived fact, because that fact is not in front of us. If it would have been in front of us, then we would not at all require inference, because then it would be known through perception or pratyaksh. But here, since it's not directly available to us, so here we come to the conclusion of that unperceived facts or an event based on something which was observed earlier, or the observed evidences which is related to that unperceived fact. So Nyāya inference relies on the structured framework of premises, including the major term, that is Sadhya, the minor term, that is Paksh, and the middle term, that is Hetu, which together forms a syllogism. So the inference is considered valid when it adheres to specific rules and conditions, such as the invariable concomitance or Vyapti between the middle term and the major term. So we are aware about the constant conjunction between smoke and fire. So most of us know that there is this constant conjunction, or you can say constant connection basically, between smoke and fire. So how do we know that? That is precisely being known with the help of Vyapti. And through the process of Vyapti, or the whole process of inference, that we come to know this. When we see smoke, we come to know about fire. So when we observe smoke on the hill, from that we deduce that there must be fire on the hill. Fine. In this scenario, the hill is the minor term, fire is the major term, and smoke serves as a middle term. Fine. So whenever we see smoke coming out of the hill, here we are not able to perceive fire since we are at a distance. So fire is not perceptible to us. What we can see is, we can only observe smoke. But from the smoke on the hill, we can deduce that there must be fire on the hill, because we know that there is a constant connection between smoke and fire. Because of that constant connection, when we see smoke or when we observe smoke, we deduce from that there must be fire. And in this whole process, the hill here becomes the minor term, the fire is the major term, and smoke serves as the middle term. So by combining our observation of the smoke on the hill with understanding that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. So we logically conclude that there is fire on the hill. And this process is what we call inference. So, how is it that we come to know about the fire on the hill? Because the fire is not directly perceptible. What we can see is smoke. But we know that they are in a constant connection with each other. So we know that wherever there will be smoke, there is fire. So when we see smoke, this is what we remember, that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. So from that, we logically conclude that since here there is smoke, there must be fire on the hill. And this whole process is considered to be as inference, or knowing this process is known as inference. So again, repeating this example, that an individual, while at a distance, he observes, or at a distance location, he observes smoke rising from the hill, and upon seeing the smoke, this person connected it to their prior knowledge that wherever there is smoke, there is also fire. A universally recognized truth applicable to situations like in kitchen, for example. So based on this established principle, they concluded that since the hill appeared to be emitting smoke, it strongly suggests that there is the presence of fire on that hill. So we need to have, or we already have, a prior knowledge of smoke always being accompanied by the fire, or their constant connection with each other. This is the prior knowledge that we already have. So we know that wherever there is smoke, there is also fire, because we have observed that in the past. So from that past knowledge, when we see a similar event happening in the present, we can deduce it from our past experience that these two things often come together. So when I see A, which is always accompanied, or which is related to B, so seeing A, we know that B must be there. Similarly is the case here. Seeing the smoke, we deduce that there must be fire, because we have seen that. Fine. In the kitchen, when we see the wood burning, we know that the smoke, wherever there is smoke, there is also fire, as in the case of the kitchen. And from that, relating it to this present scenario, the person is able to deduce fire on the hill when he observes the smoke. Now, there are two types of inferences, which is Swarthanuman, or inference for oneself, and Parthanuman, which is inference for others. So in the former, we do not require formal statements of different members of inference. It is a psychological process. Fine. So when you are trying to deduce something, when you are trying to deduce something from what you have perceived earlier, you don't need to give all the steps of inference. That happens internally as a psychological process. So here we do not require formal statements or a formal way of putting the whole syllogism. This happens psychologically and internally. So when we see smoke, immediately we come to know that there must be fire. So that is happening within ourselves, and we do not need to make or utter statements and then come to a conclusion based on the premises. That kind of formal statement is not required when you are doing inference for your own self. So it is Swartha Anuman, that means it is for oneself. And here we do not require that whole process. We know that by relating the unperceived with what has been perceived, or relating it to what has been perceived earlier, and through that we come to know it. While in the later case, which is the Prartha Anuman or inference for the other, here we need syllogism and we need to provide the formal statement. So it has to be presented in language, and this has to be done only to convince the other. Fine, so consider, let's take an example again of the smoke and fire. So when you are trying to deduce from the smoke the existence of fire for oneself, you do not have to utter the whole statement that whenever there is smoke, there is fire, as in the case of the kitchen. So if I see smoke on the hill, then there must be fire. That doesn't happen when you are trying to deduce it for yourself. But when you are trying to make the other person convinced of this connection or the presence of the fire on the hill in this case, you have to explain it with the help of language. So you have to explain them through the whole process, that you have seen that, or you have that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. You have seen it earlier in your past experience. Since here you can see smoke, from that we can deduce that there is fire. So this kind of reasoning, this kind of inferential process is required only when you need to convince the other, or when you are trying to explain it to the other person. That is when the language and the whole process has to be explained verbally to the other person. So there are 5 members in Nyāya syllogism. So when you are explaining it to the other, or when you are trying to convince the other, there are 5 members that are required in the Nyāya syllogism. And on the basis of that, you will make the other person understand this kind of relationship between the major, minor and the middle term. On the basis of that, you will draw a conclusion. So the first in these 5 members, the first is called pratigya or proposition. So it is a logical statement which is to be proved. The second is the hetu or the reason, which states the reason for the establishment of the proposition. The third is called udharan, which gives the universal concomitance together with an example. The fourth is upanay or the application of the universal concomitance to the present case. And the fifth is nigaman or conclusion drawn from the preceding propositions. These 5 propositions of Indian syllogism are called members or avyayas. Stating it again, so when you are trying to make this whole syllogistic syllogism, then these 5 processes or these 5 members have to be included. So we will discuss this further in the next lecture. Do stay with us, where we will discuss that how these together and help us in drawing a conclusion or creating a whole inferential knowledge. So thank you friends, and see you in the next lecture.